In this video, we're going to take a look at a very old Spanish arrastra. We're going to take a peek at an old gold mine. We're going to talk about how ancient smelters work. And we're going to talk about a lot of the technological innovations that took place over the centuries that would have allowed, like your Spanish conquistadors, to turn, rock, gold-bearing rock, into gold bars. So how did they do that? How did that process work? And we're going to find out in this video. Looks like we might get a little bit of rain. I hope not. And so in this video, by no means is this meant to be like an exhaustive list of every ancient mining technique. That'd be impossible to do and way outside of the scope of this video. But what we are going to do is we're going to highlight some of the key methods and innovations that took place. And we're going to focus on hard rock mining and not placer mining. And so humanity, we've been hard rock mining for a very long time, tens of thousands of years. And the oldest mining site the archaeologists have found is in Swaziland in Africa. And back then they were mining a deposit of hematite, an iron type ore, and they were using the hematite to make what's called ochre, red ochre, and it's a pigment. And of course they were using this pigment for cosmetic reasons or ceremonial reasons or to decorate their houses or pottery and stuff like that. And back then, we're talking about the Stone Age, and they had very primitive tools. The tools would have been made out of rocks and different animal bones and stuff like that. And then what happened is eventually humanity discovered how to create copper. And this probably started with processing malachite ore, which is a copper type ore. And they learned how to work copper. And copper tools were a great improvement over Stone Age tools. And this led to, what's called the Copper Age. And then what happened is you had somebody who figured out that by adding tin to the copper, they could create an entirely new metal, and that new metal is called bronze. And bronze was a great improvement over copper, and this led to the Bronze Age. Now the problem with bronze is it requires tin, and tin was in short supply. There were only so many of known deposits of tin in the ancient world, and this required like these extensive trade networks. And oftentimes, for various reasons, these trade networks would get disrupted. Now, all around the earth, even here where we're at now, I guarantee you today I'm going to come across probably numerous deposits of iron. Iron is very common. It's not very difficult to find. And so the ancients during this time, they were aware of iron and they knew how to work iron. And so what happened is because of the scarcity of the tin, they started working more with iron and developing methods where they could perfect the iron. And this led us out of the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. And it's kind of weird, but this little creek, look at all these crawdads everywhere, dead crawdads. It's kind of weird. I wouldn't expect to find crawdads in a creek like this. But anyways, this led to the Iron Age. And then what happened is they were gradually, perfecting iron, making better tools and equipment. And then they learned over time to remove a lot of the impurities from the iron and to start adding carbon. And this created a new metal called steel. And steel, it's a lot harder to make because it required a lot higher temperature. But you did have some ancient blacksmiths, primarily in the Middle East and in Asia, where they were making a very high quality of steel. It's called Wootz steel or crucible steel. And even to this day, they try to unlock the secrets of how these ancient blacksmiths were able to create such a high quality of steel. But steel really didn't take off until the Industrial Revolution, where you had new technologies in manufacturing where they could produce, a higher quantity of steel for industry. All right, so over time, you have this progression of metals where they're getting better and better. But the problem is rocks, like all these rocks around us. And rocks are very hard. Minerals are just, for the most part, they're very hard. And there was a geologist by the name of Friedrich Mohs. And in, when was it? I think it was around 1812. If I'm wrong, I'll correct myself down below. But he created what's called the Mohs hardness scale. And this scale is used even to this very day. And the criteria he used was it's basically like a mineral's ability to resist scratching. And that's what he based this numerical scale on. And so like quartz, for example, I was trying to find some quartz, but I don't see any right here. But quartz is a very hard mineral. And a lot of your gold is commonly found in quartz. So quartz is a 7. And, that's very hard. And for example, the pocket knife that I bring around with me out on trips like this, my pocket knife, and of course the blade is made of steel, it's only around about 6.5 hardness. So I can scratch quartz, but it's very difficult to do. And so these ancient miners, to do any type of hard rock mining where you're just sitting there and using hammers and chisels and tunneling into the rock was very difficult. All right, I found us a nice, beautiful quartz vein. And quartz. All right, so like quartz is where you find a lot of gold. Most of your rich gold mines historically have came from this mineral right here, quartz rock. And so remember on the Mohs scale, quartz is a 7. Now this knife that I use with the steel blade, this is probably right around that, maybe 6.5, 7. I'm really not sure. So when I scratch on quartz with my knife, like when I'm trying to test something, I can scratch the quartz, but it takes a lot of effort. I really got to put some muscle into it, and I got to work at it. And so the ancients came up with a very ingenious method to overcome this obstacle, even using more primitive tools. Because remember, they had to tunnel in to this hard quartz and hard rock to extract the minerals. And the method they came up with is called fire setting. All right, we got a little beautiful location, and it looks like some people have camped out right here and built their fire against this cliff, and they were doing a little bit of fire setting and probably didn't even know it. But fire setting, it's a very ancient practice, and it was used all around the ancient world. And the Spaniards, in the early days here in America, this is one of the methods they were using for mining. And how it worked, it's very simple but very ingenious. And so they would stack wood, just a lot of wood, right here and get it as close to the rock as they can. So they'd have a big, gigantic stack of wood. And then they'd light that wood on fire, and the intense heat from the fire, it would heat up the rock. The rock would get glowing red, and this would create a thermal shock in the rock, and the rock would start to crack and fracture into little pieces. And then, if possible, at that point, what they would do is they'd come in with water while the rock's still glowing red. They'd come in with water and throw it on the rock, and this would intensify that thermal shock. And then once this process was done, they would come in here and with their hammers and chisels, and so you can see where this fire has loosened this rock, right? And it's cracked it. And they would come in here and they would just remove all of this loose material, and they would dig it all out, right? All the loose material. And then once they had everything removed, and then they would just simply continue the process. They'd build another fire, heat up the rock, get the thermal shock, and then break the rock apart. Now this worked very good until it didn't. The problem with fire setting was you would reach a point where you could only go so far. You could only tunnel so deep using this method. And what would happen is once you got back there so far, you wouldn't have the oxygen needed to feed the fire and get that intense heat. And not only that, but it was extremely dangerous, because when you got back there so far and you're stacking up all your wood and then you're lighting your fire, well, as that fire took off, you know, it's creating a lot of smoke, and that smoke would fill up the tunnel. And these old miners, you know, at that point, if they didn't get out quick enough, they would die of suffocation. And during the 9th century, the Chinese would invent gunpowder. And following that time period, you'd have different people experimenting around with gunpowder, trying to find different applications. But for whatever reason, it was mainly just used in like military applications or signal flares or fireworks and stuff like that. And this would start to change in the 1600s when the French would start to experiment with gunpowder in mining. And gunpowder proved to be quite effective. You know, it was a good way to blast through hard rock. And it most definitely helped out the miners who were using it. The problem with gunpowder is it wasn't very safe, and it was very expensive. And then in 1867, you had a very brilliant chemist by the name of Alfred Nobel. This is interesting. Somebody drilled a core hole right there. I wonder why. But Alfred Nobel, he invented dynamite. And dynamite revolutionized mining. Dynamite, you could easily blast through hard rock, hard material. And following dynamite, you know, you had these other technological innovations. And dynamite and its predecessors are still used to this very day. Right now we're hiking up to an old gold mine I found years ago. Man, we still got a long hike to go. It's a ways up there. But I just want to take a minute, and I want to thank all of you who have supported this channel. When you hit the, you know, just watching the videos, hitting that thumbs up, the comments, I read all the comments, and a lot of you will send me emails, and I love the emails. Some of you have asked me because you've had a hard time sending emails, and so in the description of the videos, I'm going to start putting the email address where you can contact me by email if you have something private that you want to discuss. But I never really wanted to start a YouTube channel. A couple of years ago, like the stuff I'm doing now, this is just me. I've always done this stuff. And I would create like these video files that I could share mainly with my dad and a couple of close friends. And then my internet service provider, for whatever reason, the files were too large and I could no longer do that. And that's when I started the YouTube channel. It was just meant as a way to share some videos. And back then, man, I'd get like 100 views a month. And I thought that was so cool. I can't believe like 100 people would watch these videos. And then now, recently, you know, this channel averages about 50,000 views a month, which is just unreal for me. You know, I'd never expected anything like that. And sometimes people, you know, they want me to make a video like every week. And man, trust me, if I could, I would. You've had a animal bed down right here. But the nature of what I do, you know, I only film stuff that I can find in real life. And you know, that's very difficult to do. I feel blessed just to do it as much as I have. But I just want to take just a few minutes and just thank all of you for supporting the channel, and it's most definitely appreciated. All right, we've made it. And this is the old mine. And this was mined by the Americans in the 1800s. This area where we're at, back in the olden days, they pulled a lot of gold and silver out of this area. This one, you can see where this wooden post used to prop up the rock right here, but it's all collapsed. And so this isn't supporting nothing. And you can see where it's getting ready to go anytime now. So I imagine not too many more years, this mine will be sealed up just naturally. This is going to give way. It's already started, and it'll collapse and it'll just seal all of this off. And then eventually you'll never even know. There used to be an old mine right here. But let's see, I gotta be careful. I don't want to hit this rock and cause it to come crashing down. Tight fit. All right, let's see. Let there be light. That's better. Beautiful, beautiful old mine. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time in here. The last time I came in here, I got really sick. And so I think a lot of the air in here is bad air. But I just wanted to show it to you. Let you have a look at it. But beautiful, a lot of mineralization going on. Absolutely gorgeous. I'm thinking, if I had to guess, I'd say the primary in here was probably silver, and the secondary was gold. I'm going to show you something. I've never seen anything like this. All right, look at this vein all the way And by the way, this makes this mine very unsafe. But you got this vein going all the way down. And this is, you have iron, and then more iron here. So this iron used to be a single vein, and then it split apart. And all this material you'll see, this is all clay. And all that clay filled in this crack. And these scoop marks you see, those are from me. The time I came in here where I said I spent too much time in here, I took a bunch of samples of all this clay just because I was curious. And then I used a degreasing agent and I was able to separate out all the clay. And then of course there was tons of iron left behind, just very black material. And my plan was I was going to get a magnet and remove all the iron, because inside of there you could see what looked like a gold flake, very small, like flour gold size, but tons of it. And you know, it could have been pyrite or it could have been chalcopyrite, but I had a friend and he has some daughters and they were interested in prospecting, and so I gave it to them so they could play around with it. So I never did find out what's in this clay. All right, so look, here's our clay vein again, resurfaced. All right, so let's pretend this is an old Spanish mine. The miners are in here, they're working the vein, and say they're getting really rich gold ore. So they can't take this big chunk of rock back with them to civilization. Because even though you'd have pieces of gold or silver in here, most of it's just worthless rock. And that would be very, very inefficient. And so they had to remove the gold from the rock and process everything way out here, out in the wilderness, near their mine sites. And so that's what we're going to talk about from here on out, is how did they do that? How did they turn this rock into a gold or silver bar? Man, you couldn't ask for a more pretty area. All right, right here. This is an old arrastra, and this was built by the Spaniards many centuries ago. This is very old. If we could go back in time, there would be Spaniards right here where we are standing, and they would be working their gold and their silver in this arrastra. So they obviously had some very rich mines somewhere close by. Now the Spaniards didn't invent this technology. This technology goes way back to your ancient Romans, your Phoenicians, and different groups around the Mediterranean. But what the Spaniards did was they brought this technology with them from the old world here to the new world. And we're going to go over all the mechanics of how this worked. But before we do that, we got to do a quick crash course on Mercury. And if you don't understand the way Mercury worked and the way the Spaniards used it, then you really won't appreciate this technology. So we'll come back to this here in just a minute. This process that we're going to discuss, this is called amalgamation. And I'm going to throw up a video, and you're going to see this chemist, and he's going to be feeding pure gold. That's the gold foil. It's just pure gold. He's going to be feeding this pure gold to Mercury. So this way you can see in real life how this process works. And I'll put a link to his video down below in the description. And so basically what's happening is Mercury has what's called an affinity with other metals, especially gold and silver, meaning there's a strong attraction between the two. So they go together like peanut butter and jelly, like they were made for each other. And so what happens is basically the mercury is going to dissolve and absorb the gold. And this is very important to understand. And this will help you to understand what's taking place in the arrastra. So what is mercury? Mercury is a very cool metal. It's a liquid metal, and it maintains its liquid form even at standard temperatures and pressures. And mercury has been known to the ancients for thousands of years. They found mercury in ancient Egyptian tombs. And to understand where mercury comes from, we have to start with the mineral called cinnabar. And cinnabar is a very beautiful red mineral. It was historically mined in Spain and Italy during ancient times. And so the first use for cinnabar is they would crush it up. And that's where they got that very beautiful red color, this red pigment that we call vermilion. And you'll see this red color all over ancient Roman and Greek artwork. And this red was vermilion. It was kind of similar to the color of blood. And blood was the source of life, right? Especially to the ancients. And so this vermilion color was kind of prized, almost sacred. And so how did they get mercury out of cinnabar? Well, mercury is a sulfide type mineral. It's often referred to as mercury sulfide, and it contains mercury and it contains sulfur. So lucky for us, the ancient Greek scholar named Theophractus, and he wrote a book about 2,400 years ago. And this book was talking about minerals. And luckily, this book has survived the ages. And in his works, he describes to us the process that the ancients were using to extract mercury from cinnabar. And what they would do is they would start out with a copper mortar and pestle. And the copper more than likely acted as a catalyst for the chemical reaction that was going to occur. And what they would do is they would put in cinnabar and they would crush it up in this copper. And then they would introduce vinegar, and then they would mix all that up. And then at that point, what they would do is they would take this liquid soup that was left over and they would boil it off. And by doing that, it would kind of boil off a lot of the sulfur. And what would be left behind in this copper was these little pieces of liquid mercury. And that's how our ancient ancestors were able to process mercury. All right, we've had our crash course on mercury. So we're ready to see how this thing worked, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw up an image of an old arrastra that's been restored. And this way you sort of get a visual of what I'm talking about. All right, so how this thing worked and operated. All right, you got this little hole right here in the middle. Set in that hole would be a vertical wooden post. And it would come up, and that wooden post would be able, or need to be able to operate freely to turn back and forth with no restriction. So you have this vertical wooden post coming up, and then setting on top of that, you would have a horizontal post like that. And attached to this horizontal post would be two large rocks, and they would be set opposite of each other. Now, most of your old arrastras would have two rocks, and this worked as kind of like a counterbalance. But there are some that would only have a single rock. And these rocks would be connected to the wooden post by a chain, usually a chain. And the rock, you know, these are big rocks that were drug around in here. And you can see all the erosion that occurred. So, you know, they processed a lot of gold and silver in this way back in the day. But these rocks, they would have to be of a very hard material. So, you know, you're not going to be using like sandstone or limestone or something like that. It'll be like a, you know, a granitic type or igneous type rock. And so what would happen is they would have a big old pile of gold ore. And I bet you there's a good chance they were stacking it right here. And so I brought along a piece of gold ore. All right, so right here, here's a piece of gold ore. You got your rock, you got the gold, and we need to separate the two. So they're not going to throw this whole rock in there. They're going to kind of speed up the process. So they're going to take all their pieces of ore and smash it into smaller pieces. They're going to take all those smaller pieces and spread out in here. So this thing would be full of just broken pieces of gold ore. And, oh, one thing I forgot to mention, your power source to turn all of this. They did use slaves or hired help, you know, to power this thing. You talk about a crummy job, right? But for the most part, they used animals like horses, mules, and donkeys. And that's what was turning the horizontal pole and dragging along these big stones. So they would take all this crushed ore, spread it out in here. Now they're not going to add the mercury, not yet. And the reason why is because they need to crush down this ore a bit more, because they want to increase the contact point, increase the surface area of the gold, and that'll give them the best odds of the mercury picking up all of the gold. But they can't wait too long because gold's very heavy, it's very dense, and it's going to settle down to the bottom. So they had to time it just right. So they would start spinning this thing and spinning it, dragging these stones, crushing the ore. And then when they were ready, they would start to introduce mercury just in different areas. And these large stones would spread that mercury around and mix it in with this rich gold ore. And then what's going to happen is the gold's going to start bonding with the mercury. The mercury is going to become very heavy, and it's going to start settling down to the bottom of this thing, as will all the other heavy material. So you're going to have your heavy material on the bottom, and you're going to have the lighter material on top. And so what they would do when they were all finished and they thought they'd captured all the gold, they would have buckets. And right here, you can't see it, but there's a creek that flows down through here. They would go down there and fill up buckets of water, and then they would bring that water up here and they would splash it in here, just like that. And this would wash away all that loose material. So centuries ago, when they were right here doing their work, you know, this would have been a muddy mess. And so they washed away all that loose material, and then all they had to do was go around and dig through everything and find the pieces of mercury that had trapped all of that rich gold. And so now we're going to talk about the process of how they separated the mercury from the gold. So during this time period, the time period of exploration and conquest, the time of your conquistadors, the Spanish government basically had a monopoly on the mercury trade. Most of your mercury was being sourced from Spain or the Spanish colonies in Peru. The only other major mines outside of Spanish control during this time were located in Slovenia. And so the Spanish government, there was never enough mercury, by the way. There was quotas that these mines were supposed to meet every year. And as hard as they tried, they just couldn't. There was too much of a demand for the mercury. The miners here in the New World needed that mercury, and there was never enough to go around. And so mercury was very valuable. You most definitely didn't want to lose your mercury. You needed to recycle it so you could use it over and over and over again. And the Spanish government, they were actually able to manipulate the price of silver on the open market based upon how much mercury they allowed to flow out there in the open market to be consumed. And they were also heavily taxing the mercury. So they were making a lot of money on the mercury. And so this is how the recovery process worked to separate your gold from your mercury, because now you got this piece of mercury, but inside of it is trapped the gold. You need the gold, of course, but you also need the mercury. And it's a very simple process, but they would take a cloth like this and say this is your piece of mercury. They'd put it inside the cloth. And then what they would do is they would just wring it like this and just squeeze it and squeeze it and squeeze it, putting that pressure in here on the mercury. And the mercury would be forced out the other end of the cloth. And this would leave behind a little gold or silver button. But this little button would still contain mercury. There'd still be small amounts of mercury trapped in here. And to get the last bit of mercury separated from the gold, they used what's called a distillation retort. And retorts, they go all the way back to ancient times. They found retorts made out of clay in India that are thousands of years old. Your alchemists, these men like wizards that were trying to create gold in their laboratories, they worked a lot with mercury, and they would use retorts. A lot of your old retorts are usually made out of copper or bronze. Eventually, they'd be made out of glass. And you can still buy them today. You can buy retorts on Amazon. I think they're like probably 30, 40, 50 bucks. And so how a retort worked was you have this vessel, and on top of the vessel you have what's called a neck, and usually it'll bend around like that. And mercury has a very low boiling point. And so what happens is you put this gold button inside this enclosed vessel. It has to be enclosed because you don't want mercury escaping out. And then you apply heat to it. And as this gold button would heat up, that mercury inside would flash off into a vapor, and it would rise up. And then it would hit this neck. And this neck acted as a condenser, and the mercury would cool down and turn back into a liquid. And then they could collect that liquid mercury on the discharge side of that neck. And so that's how the process worked and how they were able to separate your gold from your mercury. Now that process that we just finished talking about with the arrastra and the mercury, it worked great with native gold and native silver. But unfortunately, most of your silver comes as compounds bonded with other elements. Like, think of it like this. When was the last time you ever heard of anybody coming to a stream like this and panning for silver nuggets? Probably never, right? And that's because it's very rare to find silver in its native form. That doesn't mean you don't. There's most definitely been some very large deposits of native silver that have been discovered. It's just not very common. Most of the time your silver mineral is usually acanthite. That's probably the most common I know of. And acanthite is, part silver and 2 parts sulfur. And that's very common for your silver deposits. Another example would be like galena. Galena, you have lead, a little bit of silver, and 2 parts sulfur, if I remember right. And so what happened in the 1500s is the Spaniards were very quickly going through all the high-grade silver. And what was left behind was this low-grade silver, and it was very difficult to remove the silver from this ore. And it's estimated that they were actually wasting around 30% of the silver. It wasn't being processed. And to make matters worse, or worse for them, is during this time period, there's a very influential priest by the name of Bartolome de Las Casas. And he was a very good priest. And he had a deep love for the Indian peoples of the Americas. And he had personally witnessed hundreds of these Indians being enslaved and dying. And he made it his goal to end slavery of the Indians here in the Americas. And this priest was very influential with Charles V. And Charles V was the king of Spain during that time. And so Charles V ended up implementing what's called the New Laws. And these new laws basically outlawed Indian slavery here in the New World. Right here, just so you know, this is an old Arrastra. This one was built by the Americans. I'm not going to talk about this one. I'm going to save it for a different video. There's an old gold mine I'm looking for. So I found the Arrastra. I found their smelter. I found where they were living. I found a lot of their old trees they'd cut up on the mountain for mining timbers, but I haven't found the mine, not yet. But anyway, so Charles V created these new laws outlawing Indian slavery here in the New World. And the ruling class here in the New World, I mean, there was a complete rebellion against these new laws. And eventually, unfortunately, many of them were overturned. And it even led to a civil war in Peru. But these laws went a great way in making the lives of the Indians to greatly improving their lives. And so now you have this low-grade silver. It's difficult to abstract the silver. You can no longer have Indian slaves. If you want to have Indian workers, you have to pay them. And so there was a belief at that time that the silver trade that was pretty much dominated by the Spaniards was going to end as quickly as it began. And there was a man, a very brilliant man by the name of Bartolome Medina, and he was a Spaniard, and he created, with the help of a German friend, a very ingenious way to process this low-grade silver. And this process is called the Patio Process. And how it worked was you would take, and I'll throw up an image so you can kind of see what it looked like, but you would take like a large area and you would build this enclosure, and it's usually a circular enclosure, and it was usually constructed of wood, and it'd have to be sealed up because you didn't want all the liquid leaching out. So they would crush up the ore in their rostra, but they'd have to crush it up to like a really fine material, and then they would spread it out in this area. And then they would add water, they would add salt, they would add mercury, and they would add copper sulfate to the mixture. And then if they had Indian laborers or Indian slaves, they would have them barefoot walk around in all this mixture. And by the way, that's how a lot of the Indians died, is in this patio process, because they died from mercury poisoning. If they didn't want to pay Indian laborers, or they didn't dare risk getting Indian slaves, they would use horses. That was very common. So they had horses all day long, just going in circles, mixing this material together. And it required a lot of sun. So you needed the energy, the heat from the sun. That was part of this process. And this would go on for 2 to 3 weeks. And during that time, you'd have this chemical reaction that would occur, and the silver would be unbonded from these other elements and revert back to native silver, where it could be absorbed into the mercury and then processed. Right now, I'm going to show you an old Spanish mining site located in the Uinta Mountains of northeastern Utah. And so this first image, that's the mine. And then leading away from the mine, there's a trail, and the trail goes for about 160 feet. At the end of this trail, you have the old arrastra, where they were crushing and processing the gold and the silver out of this mine. And then as you go, there's a canyon that'll kind of lead up into this area. And as you go down away from the mine site, down an elevation through this canyon, at the mouth of the canyon is the old smelter, where they were casting their gold and silver bars. So this is an interesting site because you can see everything from start to finish. You have the mine where they're getting the ore, you have the arrastra where they were processing the ore, and you have the smelter where they were melting down the gold and silver to cast their bars. So a really interesting site. And speaking of smelters, so now we're going to talk about how they took this gold and melted it down into bars that could easily be transported and accounted for. And this video clip you're going to see, this is from a video I did recently called Gold Out of an Old Spanish Mine or something like that. But I'll put a link to that video down below if you want to watch it in its entirety. In the Uinta Mountains, there's certain areas you can go to where you can still find old Spanish smelters. A lot of them are in very poor shape because over the years you've had careless people go in there just tearing them apart, looking for scraps of gold and silver, which is a real shame. I'm not going to show an image of this particular smelter that we're going to talk about because I don't want to give away the location. But what I'll do is, for those of you not familiar with what Spanish smelters look like, I'll find a picture on the internet, hopefully one that's very intact, and then that way you can get a good visual of what I'm talking about. But these old smelters, just think of, they're like primitive ovens made out of rock and clay that were used to process, to smelt the ore. And how they worked was you'd start with your ore and you'd crush your ore, and then you'd remove the metal, and then you would place this ore in a crucible, and you would put the crucible in the furnace, and then you'd pack charcoal all the way around it, on top of it, everywhere you could put charcoal. And the charcoal served two purposes. First, it was your source of heat. It was your source of fuel. But second, it would act as a reducing agent, and it would help reduce the oxygen in the metal, helping to create a more pure metal. And then you'd have like a bellow type system to force oxygen into the furnace to bring everything up to these high temperatures. And so as the metal's in there melting, what happens is you get these different oxides and different materials that kind of form around the metal. And this is called slag. And slag is just a natural byproduct of the smelting process. And so then they would remove the slag, and they would dip it in water to hurry and cool it off. And this is why all of your smelters, you'll notice they're always by a source of water, usually a small stream. And then once they cooled off the slag, then they would take hammers and they would remove the slag from the metal. And then they would take the pieces of metal, put it back into a crucible, put the crucible into the oven, melt it, and then at that point, they were able to pour their bars. And another thing you'll notice about the smelters in the Uinta Mountains is not always, but more often than not, they're down at a lower elevation. So the smelter will be low and your mine will be up high. And there's a very practical reason for this. So as you go up in elevation, you go up in altitude, you have a loss of atmospheric pressure. So you have a decrease in your oxygen density. And this is why people, especially people who come from lower elevation states, when they go into areas like the high Uenas, sometimes they'll suffer from altitude sickness, and they'll get sick or delusional, and sometimes it's pretty severe, and they'll have to be taken to the hospital. But it's because their body's not getting enough oxygen because they're at this high elevation. And the exact opposite occurs when you go down in elevation, down in altitude. Your oxygen density increases. The Spaniards needed the excess oxygen to be able to bring their furnaces up to the desired temperature and maintain it. Keep in mind, the melting point for gold, for example, is around 1,948 degrees. In this video, we covered a lot of information. And so if you're still with me, I appreciate it. And I hope you enjoyed the content and you found it useful. But I want to take just a couple of seconds and give a little shout out. There's a couple guys on YouTube, just normal guys like me that do this kind of stuff for fun. The first one is AV Adams. He's based out of New Mexico. He does very good research. He also operates a website called Adams Lost Gold. The other guy is Silver Spike Prospecting. He's based out of Salt Lake, and he goes around and he'll mine minerals, and then he has like a little smelter in his backyard. He'll melt everything down, but he also creates his own music, and he incorporates that music into a lot of his videos. So very talented guy, both of these individuals. I'll put a link to some of their videos down below if you want to check them out. But with that being said, as always, thank you for watching, and I wish you all the very best.